This video is over Unit 9, Learning Targets 5 through 8. This is the nervous system. Three basic parts of the nervous system are the brain, of course, and the spinal cord, and then the individual nerve cells also are a big part of the nervous system. The brain is broken up into two sections, or not the brain, the nervous system is, to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. You can see here it's centralized in the body, and so that's helpful in that it's the central nervous system. This is where all the integration in your nervous system takes place. And then there is the peripheral nervous system, and periphery means like to the outside or to the edges, and so you can imagine everything here and here being out to the edges of the nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system receives information from the outside world as well as sends information to the muscles or to the glands in your body. Now, another two divisions that the nervous system is divided into are the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, auto means self, nomos law, and so autonomic nervous system is like a law to itself in that it acts without you having to think about it. When you open your eyes, you see things. You don't have to tell your eyes to work. Your eyes automatically adjust to the amount of light that's in the room without you having to think about it. When you breathe in air, your lungs take that air and do something with it without you having to think about it. You actually breathe without you having to think about it. Your heart beats, your food digests, your kidneys work, etc. This is your autonomic nervous system. Your somatic nervous system is the rest of your nervous system, primarily composed of that, which is made up in your muscles. If you think about your muscles, you can contract a muscle by thinking about it and by doing it. And so that would be part of your somatic nervous system or your body nervous system. The way that, or the basic pathway in the nervous system follows this order. There are three steps. And first is from sensory input. And I have sensory neurons here, but that's fine. The sensory neurons receive information. This man in this picture is looking at that glass of water, and so he's receiving information from the outside world. His eyes are telling him that that glass of water is there. Now his brain, the next step is integration, and his brain actually thinks about that water. His brain can think, well, I'm thirsty, we need water, or I'm not thirsty, we don't need any water. And the brain does this both consciously, like you thinking about it, man, I'm thirsty, I need a drink of water, or subconsciously, maybe your part of your body is dehydrated or something and you have no way of knowing, but your brain is able to know those things. And so integration is it takes the message and it integrates it into the body, as in what does the body need to do. And then the brain sends a message out, and that is the output, the motor output. The motor means to move, and so the output is reach out and grab the glass and get a drink. That is the motor output. And so your brain works in that major pathway. I use this illustration a lot, but you put your hand on a burner, the hand receives information that the pain receptors and the heat receptors in your hand receive information. The brain says, that's hot, we should save our hand. That's integration. And then the motor input or output is you actually moving your hand off of the burner. And all that happens within very few milliseconds. Neurons represent the individual units of the nervous system. A neuron is another word for nerve cell, and so those two things can be used interchangeably. And a neuron looks just like you see here. It's made up of several important parts. First, you have this major body here. It's called the cell body, and of course you see the nucleus in it. And all around the cell body are these dendrites. Where dendrite is, means tree, and it looks like, literally does look like little trees if if you wanted to put leaves on them or whatever. But the dendrites receive, the color here, receive information from the outside. And all that information builds up in the cell body. Now, information received by the nervous system and sent by the nervous system is in one form, electrical, or primarily one form. We'll talk about it a little bit where that changes. And so all of the information is received by the dendrites and sent out along the axon, which is this long tube there off to the right. And on the axon are these little pieces called the terminal. It's like in an airport. The terminal is the place that's like at the end, where the end of your time in the airport is at the terminal. It's where you get on the plane. Well, the terminal is the end of the axon, and the axon terminal usually connects to a muscle or another nerve. A few other pieces here. This myelin sheath. This is a covering of the axon. It acts to insulate the message, the electrical signal. Two things. It allows that electrical signal to travel more efficiently, and it also protects the surrounding tissue from damage. Someone who has multiple sclerosis or MS, their myelin sheath is breaking down, which causes decreased motor function because their nerves aren't firing as well, and also muscle damage, which is why they're always in pain, because their muscles are constantly, or their nerves are constantly shocking their muscles. Now, the nervous system works, and this electrical impulse is passed down the nervous system primarily using diffusion. Now, we've talked a lot about diffusion. Diffusion is the way that your body primarily works in most of its systems, and diffusion is just simply the act of larger particles passing from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And you see that here. It goes from here, passes, and it's to where it gets to where it is at equilibrium, where both are the same on either side. And when there is an amount here built up and nothing here, we say that is a concentration gradient. It's like being at the top of the hill on your bicycle. Right? There is the ability to do some work. Now, your body likes a concentration gradient because with a concentration gradient, it can do some work. At equilibrium, work is not able to be done unless that concentration gradient is reestablished. It's like pushing your bike back up the hill once you're done. And so the nervous system is going to work largely this way. One important part of the nervous system is what's called a sodium potassium pump. Sodium Na, potassium Ka. I put the pluses there because these are ions. Remember, an ion is a charged particle. Both of these are lost an electron, so that makes them positive. And a pump means that it requires energy. And there's our friend ATP, which is the energy of the cell. And these pumps work to create the concentration gradient in the nervous system. So whereas a system might look like this, the pumps are trying to pump them to where there is a concentration gradient, where they look like this, where they're ready to do some work. Now here you see a picture of how these pumps work. I'm not altogether concerned that you are able to detail how these pumps work. That's not within the scope of our class, but I do need you to understand that there are sodium-potassium pumps on the membrane of the nerve cells that work to create that concentration gradient. And the concentration gradient in a nerve cell is called its resting potential. When the nerve is at resting potential, it is able to do work. Now, what is the work that a nerve cell does? The work that a nerve cell does is create a nerve impulse. Remember I said earlier that the nervous system uses electricity. Well, a nerve impulse is just an electrical signal. And this electrical signal is created when the sodium and potassium ions essentially switch places in the nerve cell. Let me draw a picture real quick to demonstrate this. So here's a cell membrane. This represents a piece of a nerve cell here, piece of a neuron. And on the outside of the nerve cell, you have lots of sodium ions. These sodium ions they're just out there. That's where they go. And the charge of the outside of the cell is largely positive. On the inside of the cell, you have some potassium ions. Now, the potassium ions are also positive. However, inside the cell, the charge is largely or slightly negative. The reason it's negative has to do with the proteins that are inside the cell membrane. And so what you have here is something very similar to a concentration gradient. There's a charge gradient, positive on one side, negative on the other. Well, what are positive and negative? They're attracted to one another, all right? And so those sodiums, if given the opportunity, what will they do? Well, if given the opportunity, they will pass into here. And the same with the potassiums. If given the opportunity, they will go outside. All right, and so that's what we're going to see in this system. So with a nerve impulse, something occurs, one of two things. Go back here. So just think about this. You have an entire rest of the nerve back here, and let's say that the signal is actually going to be traveling this way. And this is a nice shoddy attempt at creating some electricity. Well, the signal has to come from someplace, and so back here on this off the cell that's off the page, the signal is traveling to the right and eventually gets to this point. Well, that is going to cause the sodium to act, and it's going to cause all of these little protein channels that are on the membrane. There's a protein channels. This is not the sodium potassium pumps. All right. And it causes it to go from resting potential, which you see here, here's the resting potential, and this charge like represents the inside of the cell. Well, something acts on that cell and it causes the inside of the cell to become extremely positive. How does it do that? Well, that action potential, well, I didn't mention action potential yet, but the nerve impulse traveling down the nerve causes the sodium to rush into the cell. Now, what is that going to do to the charge of the inside of the cell? It's going to change it. And so, whereas before we had poles, we had a positive and a negative pole, now we have depolarized the cell. There's no longer poles because we have depolarized, which is what you see here. This nerve impulse hitting the nerve causes sodium to rush into the cell, causing an action potential to occur, which is the next word. I keep using that, I might as well define it. The action potential is just the nerve impulse itself firing. It is the firing of the nerve impulse. And the change in charge needs to get up to a certain amount, which is not that important for us. And once it does that, the nerve will actually fire. All the sodium rushes in, and so both sides are positive. Well, in order to repolarize the cell, the potassium will now move out. And this is in an effort to repolarize, to reestablish the poles. And so what you see here is you see that very thing happening. As sodium rushes into the cell becomes repolarized. Now the problem here is that we're not back to where we started. Because where we started was sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. And so we need to get back to that same level. And then this is where the sodium-potassium pumps come in, that we mentioned up here. They will actually take and pump the sodium back outside and the potassium back inside and return the cell to resting potential. And once it gets back to resting potential, it is able to fire another nerve impulse. All right, so you have resting potential, which resting potential is when the nerve is ready to fire, ready to pass an impulse. Depolarization, and depolarization is when the inside of the cell becomes positive because sodium rushes in because it was acted on by something outside of the cell. The action potential, which is the actual nerve impulse firing, once that amount of sodium gets to a certain amount, the charge goes off and it causes it to, it gets a certain amount of power and then kind of turns on and passes that nerve impulse to the next part of the cell. And then it is repolarized when the sodium goes out of the cell in order to get it back to normal. And then the sodium potassium pumps work to return the cell to resting potential. Don't worry about the hyperpolarization there. We're not going to concern ourselves with that. All right, so here you see another picture of this. And you can see the sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. And then this is just a section of a nerve here. And so this picture may be a little better for some of you. And so the sodium again rushes in, the potassium goes out. And essentially what you have going down the length of the nerve is this change in charge. Let me zoom in a little bit here. Sodium rushes in, causes the action potential. That depolarization causes the action potential. Well, as the action potential moves down the length of the cell, there you have potassium going back out to fix it, sodium going in the next section, and then this part's to return back to normal. Sodium potassium pumps, potassium going out, sodium going in, and that action potential will move down the length of the nerve. Now, that moving down the length of the nerve is called propagation. Yep, spelled it correctly. Propagation. So the nerve impulse is being propagated down the length of the nerve. Here's another picture of this. Same thing happening. You can see back in the background there's the cell body, and this is the axon that this is occurring on. Don't concern yourselves with the Schwann cell, but these are the myelin sheaths that are covering the nerve, and these red arrows represent the propagation of the nerve cell. And what's interesting about the myelin sheath is it's actually nonpolar. So these ions don't mix well with it, and so they'll actually jump over, which causes your nerve impulses to be a lot faster. Just an interesting fact. I will mention the Schwann cells because they do have something to do with the myelin sheath. They actually produce the myelin sheath, the Schwann cells do. All right. So what happens to the nerve impulse when it gets to the end of the nerve? You can see here, let me zoom in a little bit. What this is showing you here is this is zoomed in on that area where the axon of one nerve touches the dendrite of the other. Now, it's important to know that this is the way that a nerve impulse travels, the way that we just got through talking about. This is the way a nerve impulse travels, whether it's on an axon or a dendrite. It doesn't matter. This is just how the nerve impulse travels. This is a close-up of the synaptic terminal region. And so here you have the terminal end of one axon here, and the end of maybe the cell body or the dendrite, either way. And so how does the message get across this space? Because notice those two nerves aren't touching. This space has a name, and it's called the synapse. That's why all these things are called synaptic, because it's the synapse. The nerves don't actually touch one another. Why? Because the electricity would damage the other nerve, and so they don't touch one another. So how does this work? Well, the electricity moves down, and as it's moving down, action potential coming on down. Well, as it gets to a certain point, calcium channels near the synaptic terminal open up and cause calcium to move into the cell. This is different, and calcium has a 2+ there because it's just a different ion. It doesn't signify anything drastically different than what we're doing. It's just calcium. And calcium goes in, and the little calcium ions will actually push these small little vesicles, remember vesicles from the cell unit, they will push these vesicles to the edge of the synaptic terminal. And each one of these vesicles is full of a substance called a neurotransmitter. Now, neurotransmitters are just chemicals that the nervous system uses to transmit the signal across the synapse. And so as they get to the edge, the membrane of the vesicle will actually fuse with the cell membrane of the cell, and it will push out the neurotransmitter into the synapse. And so we went from an electrical signal here to a chemical signal here. Now what happens? Well, you can kind of see it here. Each one of those neurotransmitters binds with a channel on the other side. And this is a close-up. Here's the neurotransmitter, the little green ball. Well, when it does that, it causes these protein channels here to open up. It's kind of like putting a key in a lock. And when they open up, it just so happens that there's a ton of sodium waiting right outside. And so as soon as that opens up, the sodium will then rush into the cell. And what does that cause? It causes depolarization, which causes an action potential to be fired. And then that action potential will propagate its way down the cell. And so we went from electrical, from one nerve, to chemical, which isn't found in the synapse with the neurotransmitter, back to electrical. So I put this in a neat little 5 steps. Action potential arrives at the end of the axon. The vesicles of neurotransmitter fuse with the membrane of the axon after they were pushed there by the calcium ions. The neurotransmitter releases into the synapse. Receptors of dendrites receive the neurotransmitter, and the neuron is depolarized, and the action potential continues. Now, here's a picture of the same thing happening on a muscle, and we will talk more about this when we do the muscular system. But this same idea happens on a muscle, and your muscles will actually receive that electrical signal, and it will cause your muscles to contract. Now, moving on past the nerve impulse. I know that was all incredibly easy. We're going to look at the brain, a little simpler, um, except not so simple. The brain is made up of 3 parts. The cerebrum, which is this the massive portion of the brain here that you normally think of when you think of a brain. And then you have the brain stem, and then you have the cerebellum. The cerebrum is where all of the thought goes on in the brain. You receive signals from the outside, and your brain integrates them and causes a motor output of some sort. And this is where that largely happens. The cerebellum has to do with involuntary movements, and the brainstem is also has to do with largely with involuntary things as well, particularly with your involving homeostasis and keeping the body at a particular state. The hypothalamus, let me mention this real quick. The hypothalamus is essentially the control center of the brain, and with it, it is able to. The hypothalamus is like the general for your body and telling your body what to do, and it reports and gives orders directly to the pituitary gland, which is kind of the commander on the field. And from the pituitary gland, all the signals of the different systems go out, which we'll talk more about that when we do endocrine system. Fairly complex. Now, as far as the cerebrum, it's divided into 4 main lobes, and the lobe is just a fancy word for like a section of the brain. And so you have the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe, use this other picture here. The frontal lobe has mainly things like reason, speech, emotions. Your frontal lobe is the part of you that separates you from most of the animal kingdom. This is, gives you your, you're able to think reasonably, you're able to think ethically, you're able to think about things. Basically, you're able to think about your own thoughts, which separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. The parietal part of your brain, this is movement, orientation, perception. A lot of your sensory receivers are in this part of the brain, and then that part of your brain also decides what it's going to do with them. The occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain, go back here. So there's the parietal, the occipital lobe. This is in the back of the brain. This is all your visual processing, an entire section of your brain just for that. How you receive visual input and what you do with that. And then the temporal lobe is hearing and memory and speech. And remember, hearing and speech are very closely related, because if you can't hear, you'll have a hard time speaking. So those 2 things are very closely related to one another. I did include this. The left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, even though they're identical in structure, have often been noted to control different centers. For instance, the right side of the brain is the more creative side of the brain, and the left side of the brain is the more analytical side of the brain. And so someone who will call themselves, I'm a right brain person, meaning that they're probably a more creative type, and a left brain person is more of a math analytical type. And it doesn't mean that if you're good at math, you can't be creative, or if you're creative, you can't be good at math, or whatever. This is just a way to decide these things. Some people are good at everything, so they just have good both sides of the brain. Here's another picture of your cerebellum. Remember, involuntary functions, involuntary movements, and your brain stem. There's a better picture of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. and you can see the different parts there. We're not going to go into all of the different parts of the brainstem, but you can see how it looks in conjunction with the rest of the brain. Now, your spinal cord is actually more involved than just a big old cord that connects everything. It does serve to connect all of the peripheral nerves as a way to send them through one major way into the brain. And also what serves to send out messages that same way. But the spinal cord actually is a part of the central nervous system in that it is able to also integrate sensory input without you having to think about it. And one example of that is something called a reflex arc. A reflex, you've all went to the doctor and been hitting the knee with a little triangle mallet and it's caused your knee to jump. And what that shows the doctor is he's testing for the health of your spinal cord, the health of your nervous system, because with that reflex arc, your brain never actually receives that message. That is completely integrated in your spinal cord. As you can see here, the uh, the mallet hits and it is sent to the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends out an immediate reaction of the leg muscles, causing the leg to kick. And so we have several of these reflex arcs. This is just the most known. You see something coming at your eye and you close your eye. It's an example of a reflex arc as well. Now, how does the brain collect all this information? Well, our five senses are important for that. Our taste, hearing, sight, smell, and touch. Um, and we have different receptors in order to collect that information. Here's five of them. The pain receptors. Pain receptors are found everywhere in your body except for your brain. And they tell your body that something's wrong because pain signals that something's wrong. Thermoreceptors, these sense hot and cold. Normally think of these as like your hands and your skin. Your lips and your mouth also very sensitive to hot and cold, obviously as a protective mechanism. Mechanoreceptors, these are sensitive to touch, to vibration. You're going to find these, your hairs, that, all over your body can sense. If the wind is blowing, for instance, you can sense that mechanoreceptor, the hair bending. In your ear actually has microscopic hairs, which that's how you hear through those vibrations. Chemoreceptors, you find these in your nose and in your mouth. They respond to chemicals, and that's why you taste. When you eat sugar, the chemical of sugar actually has a taste, and your body recognizes it as sweet. And then photoreceptors, you have these in your eyes, obviously. Now, a few terms here. I don't want to go through every single one of these because this isn't an anatomy class, but it is important to talk through several of these, particularly our major sensory organs like vision. And with your eye, the retina is where all of your sensory receptors are going to be located. And these sensory receptors in the eye are called rods and cones. The cones, as you can see here, they're the little orange ones, and the rods are the blue ones there. Zoom in a little bit. So you see the light, and this is the back of the retina, and it's all these little rods and cones. Well, the rods and cones determine how you process the light, and when they when they receive light, they fire. They cause a nerve impulse to be fired, and that nerve impulse is sent to the brain. Well, depending on which one sees it, for instance, the cones help you to see color. The rods help you to see black and white. And so we have cones in our eyes that are able to see red, green, and blue. And so you see those three colors, and your body, basically everything that you look at is a mixture of some of those three colors in one way or another. That's why if you look at like a television screen or maybe even your phone up really close, you see those three color pixels, and your brain receives those and is able to process those. Now, other animals are able to see in more colors because they have more sophisticated inputs of their eyes. Hearing, quite complex. A couple things that you need to understand here. The main organ associated with hearing is called the cochlea, and the cochlea is full of fluid. And when you hear something, the sound passes through your ear, hits the eardrum, causes it to shake. Well, the shaking goes to all these little bones right here, and then those little bones shake until they shake your cochlea, which looks like a snail. Well, that cochlea is full of fluid, and that fluid actually vibrates, and the ripples of that fluid will bend the tiny little hairs inside your cochlea, and the bending of the hair causes an action potential to be fired and sent to your brain. The semicircular canals are another important part of the ear, and it's just three. You can't really see them here. I'll try to draw them, and then one like going that way. And those three tubes basically tell you which way is up, sideways, and diagonal. They help you to know your balance. And sometimes if you've had an ear infection, either you have trouble hearing or you have trouble with your balance because the infection is causing some sort of problem with the functioning of these organs. And here's some more on that as well. Now, smell and taste, very closely related. In your brain, or in your nose, actually, so here's the nose, there's a nose, and right up here near the top, your brain actually extends some nerve fibers. Your top of your nose is really close to your brain, and they sense chemicals in the air, and you smell them. Well, notice you have this area back here called the pharynx, and the mouth and the nose are very closely related. Well, if you've ever like had inflammation, which maybe all this is clogged up, and you taste and you eat food, and if you notice the food tastes a little different, it's because you're not able to also smell it. Most of your taste is tied up in your sense of smell. I think it's like 80%. Now that doesn't mean you still don't taste. A taste bud is nothing more than a sensory receptor that has a nerve attached to it. And when for instance, you take in salt, well, that salt hits the taste bud, and the taste bud or the salt then causes an action potential to be fired and sent that message to the brain that says, hey, you just ate something salty. And lastly, the sense of touch. Now, in your skin is a very complex organ because it has several different receptors. It can sense touch, it can sense heat and cold and pain, and all of these receptors are right there under the base of your skin, as you can see. And your hairs also have nerves connected to them. As you can see that there. And so if you brush your hand across the hairs of your arm, you can feel that because your nerves are connected in that area. And some parts of your skin have a much greater degree of receptors than others. For instance, your hands, your lips are also very sensitive, and it's a protective mechanism. If you put something hot or cold in your mouth, you can do damage. Extremely cold, I guess. And so it's a way to protect. So that's the nervous system in a nutshell.